Hi everybody, and welcome to this video on variables in Stage 1 Psychology. This is obviously part of the science inquiry skills that you need to know and be aware of when we do experiments and investigations in psychology. Variables is a huge part of that. So let's get into it. So in psychology, because it is a science, we have hypotheses that we need to test. If we're doing an experimental design or a quantitative observational design, we're going to have a hypothesis, and within this hypothesis we need to have our IV and our DV sorted. So a hypothesis, as we know, is a testable prediction. It's why we're doing the experiment or the investigation. It's what we think will happen, and we're going to test to see if our hypothesis is correct or supported. So within a hypothesis we need to have at least one independent variable and one dependent variable. So let's go through these in a bit more detail. So the independent variable, or IV, as it's often represented, is the factor that is manipulated or controlled by the researcher. So an easy way to remember the difference between IV and DV, independent variable IVI. What do I have control over as the researcher? So am I able to, randomly manipulate a certain variable? Have I got control of that variable? That is the independent variable. Now, the dependent variable, or DV, is what's measured. Okay, so that's actually the results that we're trying to measure. And as the term suggests, it depends on the independent variable. So it's what's measured as a result of the IV, or independent variable. So each hypothesis should have at least one IV and DV for the investigation to be conducted properly. So these are the examples that we went through in class, but I'm just going to recap them again because revision doesn't hurt anyone. So, drinking water while driving increases driver alertness. So in this particular hypothesis, the water would be our independent variable because as the researcher, we have the control over that variable. So we can tell one group not to drink water, and then we have our treatment group that does drink water. So we have control of that variable. We manipulate that as the researcher. Now the DV, the dependent variable, is what we're measuring. So in this particular hypothesis, we're measuring driver alertness. And as the term suggests, in terms of dependent variable, driver alertness is going to depend on the water. Hence, driver alertness is the dependent variable. So if we look at the next one, we can do it using the same concepts that I've just gone through, but we'll start with the dependent variable first, because sometimes that's a little bit easier for students to get their heads around. So the colour of a room affects students' ability to focus on their work. So the dependent variable, so what we're measuring as a result of the IV, is students' ability to focus on their work. That's what we're measuring. So that's our dependent variable. Now, what's that going to depend on in this hypothesis? The colour of the room. So the colour of the room is the independent variable. So many students will work out the dependent variable first and then think, okay, what is this actually depending on? And then it's sometimes a little bit easier to find the IV or the independent variable that way. There's no rules. If you want to actually figure out the dependent variable first, go for it. So just to recap, the independent variable is the variable that we control and that we manipulate. The dependent variable is what is measured as a result and depends on the IV. Okay, now in psychology we have variables called extraneous variables. Now, as the term suggests, as you can see here, Year 11s, it's got the word extra in it. Now, we don't want these. We want to limit these as much as possible. Extraneous variables really can have a negative effect on our results. So they can actually replace the independent variable, resulting in an effect, a negative one generally, on the dependent variable. So researchers will aim to minimize as many extraneous or extra variables as possible to ensure that their results are accurate. So we've got the same two hypotheses here as before, and there's lots of different extraneous variables that we would need to consider as researchers. So again, drinking water whilst driving increases driver alertness. Well, what was their original level of alertness anyway? If they were already sleep deprived, or they were already or their level of alertness was impacted in some way, is what causing the driver alertness to be different? How can we then conclude that it's original level of alertness or the water Well, we can't. That's the problem. So extraneous variables are extra variables that can basically negatively affect our results, in other words. The time of day the experiment was conducted is also a huge extraneous variable, so we would need to consider what would be the best time of day to get as accurate results as possible. There are many, many more that we would need to consider in psychology as well. So how much water is being consumed? How long are they driving for? What are the road conditions like? What are they actually doing whilst they're driving? Are they just driving in a straight line, or are they doing complex maneuvers? And the list goes on and on and on. So, same with the next hypothesis. So the colour of a room affects students' ability to focus on their work. The colour itself is going to be a massive extraneous variable. Different colours will elicit different emotions and feelings. We know this. The size of the room, if it's a tiny room versus a big room, or a dark room versus a light room, or if it's, stuffy and too hot versus too cold, all of these things have the potential to negatively impact our results. So how can we conclude that the focus, or student focus in this example, was a result of the color of the room, or was it something else? Was it the size? Was it the temperature? Was it who else was in the room? Was it the task they were being done? All of these extra things, or extraneous variables, have the potential to replace our IV, which is what we don't want. In psychology, we want the IV to affect the DV. That's why we're doing the experiment in the first place. What we don't want is something else influencing our DV, and these are extraneous variables. So what researchers typically do is, before they even start the experiment or investigation, they'll actually sit down and list potential extraneous variables and either try and get rid of them, or they will try and control them as much as possible. So those are the variables that you need to be aware of in psychology at stage 1 level. I hope you found this video useful, everyone. As always, any questions, let me know. Happy revising. Bye.